Before a single missile was fired, before a single Iranian scientist vanished without a trace, and long before the headlines even hinted at the truth, one man had already begun writing the script for one of the most complex and silent geopolitical operations of our time. Not in months, not in election cycles, but across 3 decades of relentless vision, strategic warfare, and psychological precision. This is not a conspiracy. This is not speculation. This is the real story that the world was never meant to fully understand. This speech is not just about Iran's nuclear dream. It's about how that dream was dismantled piece by piece, not by war, but by patience. It's about how a man weaponized global perception, turned world powers into tools of pressure, and used silence more powerfully than sirens. What you're about to hear is a timeline of invisible victories, calculated disruptions, and a legacy of quiet control. You've been shown fragments in the media. You've seen fiery speeches, emotional claims, and political theater. But tonight, you're going to see the full picture. The 30-year chess game, the strategy beneath the surface, and the truth that no one dared to say out loud. Stay with this story till the very end, because once you see how deep it goes, you'll realize the war you never saw was the one that changed everything. From the moment he emerged as a prominent voice in Israeli leadership, Netanyahu identified Iran's nuclear ambitions as the greatest existential threat to the state of Israel. But instead of launching full-scale wars or public offensives, he chose to fight differently, quietly, persistently, and over time. He understood that power isn't always about brute force. Sometimes it's about timing. It's about planting the seeds of disruption and waiting for the moment they bear fruit. Netanyahu's approach was methodical. Every international speech, every intelligence leak, every warning he delivered to the world stage was part of a larger architecture of influence. He didn't just warn about Iran. He built a case so compelling that even the most reluctant global leaders began to treat Tehran as a global threat. Behind the scenes, Netanyahu empowered Israeli intelligence to operate across time zones, across borders, and across years. Assad wasn't just gathering data. It was weaving a web of strategic disruptions. Iran's program would see unexplained setbacks, mysterious malfunctions, and sudden disappearances of key scientists. Each event seemed isolated, but they were all chapters of a single book, one that Netanyahu had been authoring since the 1990s. He lobbied relentlessly, not just within his country, but across the Atlantic and beyond. He influenced the corridors of Washington, speaking not just to presidents, but to policymakers, think tanks, and media conglomerates. He shaped how Iran was perceived, framing its nuclear aspirations as the world's problem, not just Israel's. This wasn't merely diplomacy. It was psychological warfare, sustained and precise. While the world changed administrations, Netanyahu remained anchored to his vision. Others came and went. Wars began and ended. Agreements were signed and broken. But he never lost sight of his ultimate objective: to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power at any cost, at any pace. This strategic patience was often misunderstood as paranoia or overreaction. But history now reads it differently, because when you look at the timeline, you don't see a single dramatic blow that collapsed Iran's nuclear momentum. What you see is erosion, planned, intentional, and quiet. Over 3 decades, ambition turned into hesitation, and dreams turned into doubts. And through it all, Netanyahu waited for the cracks to widen, waited for international pressure to weigh down, waited for Iran to feel the burden not just from without, but from within. This wasn't a man chasing headlines. This was a man playing chess on a 30-year board, and every move, every speech, every whisper in the dark was a step toward a finish line that only he could see. Benjamin Netanyahu understood early on that in the 21st century, the most powerful weapon isn't always a missile or a drone. It's the narrative. He mastered the battlefield of perception, turning global opinion into a force of pressure more powerful than any airstrike. From the podium of the United Nations to interviews broadcast in living rooms around the world, Netanyahu didn't simply oppose Iran's nuclear program. He painted it as a ticking time bomb threatening the very fabric of global stability. And he did so not just with facts, but with fear, foresight, and forceful storytelling. His speeches were never random. Every image, every pause, every carefully chosen word was meant to shape minds. When he held up diagrams, when he warned of red lines, when he repeated the phrase, "never again," in reference to Iran's intentions, he wasn't just speaking to diplomats. He was embedding ideas into the global consciousness. He knew that once a nation is feared by the world, it becomes easier to isolate, to sanction, and to suppress. And he made sure that fear never faded from the headlines. Through calculated media outreach, he turned Western audiences into silent allies. News outlets began echoing the same concerns he raised. Think tanks picked up his talking points, and political leaders found themselves responding to the urgency he broadcasted. This wasn't accidental. It was strategic. Netanyahu's team worked tirelessly to brief foreign journalists, influence policy discussions in Washington and Europe, and ensure that the Iranian nuclear file stayed open and alarming. At the heart of this effort was the subtle manipulation of language. Iran wasn't simply a regional rival. It was rebranded as an imminent, irrational, and genocidal threat. He emphasized not just the science of uranium enrichment, but the intent behind it, always linking Iran's nuclear ambitions with apocalyptic ideologies and terrorism. This linkage, repeated again and again, transformed public perception and hardened the stance of foreign governments, even those previously open to negotiation. The genius of Netanyahu's perception warfare lay in how it extended beyond official platforms. From lobbying private think tanks to influencing social media narratives, his message was everywhere. Iran's image was never allowed to soften in the eyes of the world. Even when diplomatic openings arose, such as the JCPOA deal in 2015, Netanyahu countered them with dramatic opposition, appealing directly to U.S. Congress, breaking protocol, and taking the fight out of closed-door meetings and into the global spotlight. He made sure the world didn't see Iran as just another country. It was seen as a crisis in waiting. And as the years passed, this perception became policy. Sanctions deepened, alliances shifted. Iran found itself increasingly cornered, not just by military threat, but by a world that had been convinced, slowly, skillfully, and systematically, that Tehran's nuclear dream was not just dangerous, but unacceptable. This was Netanyahu's silent victory, changing the story so completely that even truth had to fight to be heard. The collapse of Iran's nuclear ambitions was not only shaped in boardrooms or through international pressure, it was dismantled from the shadows. Benjamin Netanyahu knew that to halt Iran's program, it wouldn't be enough to merely speak out or call for sanctions. He had to strike at the heart of their capabilities without setting off a global war. That meant launching a silent offensive, an invisible war fought with codes, spies, and precision sabotage. And it worked. They were part of a quiet campaign orchestrated over years by intelligence networks empowered by Netanyahu's unwavering directive: stop Iran, no matter how long it takes, and no matter how deep you have to go. The cyber attack known as Stuxnet was a turning point. Developed jointly by Israeli and American intelligence, the virus targeted Iran's Natanz nuclear facility with stunning sophistication. It wasn't just sabotage. It was elegance in warfare. Stuxnet infected the systems that controlled uranium enrichment centrifuges, causing them to spin wildly out of control while feeding normal readings to Iranian scientists. The result was months of wasted effort, damaged infrastructure, and deep internal confusion. By the time Iran understood what had happened, they had already lost valuable ground, and they never saw it coming. But the cyber war was only one front. Netanyahu's Israel also waged a human intelligence campaign that reached deep into Iranian soil. Mossad didn't just gather information, they acted on it. Scientists crucial to Iran's nuclear progress began disappearing, some killed in carefully orchestrated attacks that bore the signature of deep planning and local penetration. These weren't random hits. They were high-value targets. The message was clear. If you work on the nuclear program, your life is not safe. Perhaps the most audacious operation came in 2018, when Mossad agents reportedly infiltrated a Tehran warehouse and walked out with over 50,000 pages of top-secret documents detailing Iran's nuclear plans. The sheer scale of the mission stunned intelligence agencies worldwide. Netanyahu later revealed the operation publicly, holding up documents and CDs in a dramatic televised event. It wasn't just a flex of capability. It was psychological warfare. It told Iran, we know where you are, we know what you're doing, and we can get to you whenever we want. These covert actions did more than delay Iran's progress. They instilled fear, doubt, and caution within the very teams responsible for advancing the program. Scientists began to second-guess their safety. Resources were redirected from development to defense. Security paranoia grew, while trust among Iranian officials eroded. In a war that was never formally declared, Netanyahu's invisible hand reshaped the battlefield. By the time global audiences began to wonder what had slowed Iran's progress, the answer was already buried beneath years of quiet strikes, vanished scientists, and encrypted sabotage. Benjamin Netanyahu understood that even the most meticulously planned covert operations and narratives would not succeed in isolation. To truly corner Iran and collapse its nuclear dream, he needed the world, not just Israel, to act in alignment with his vision. This meant turning allies, rivals, and even neutral states into instruments of pressure, each playing a role in squeezing Iran from all directions. He wasn't content with simply sounding the alarm. He set out to ensure the world heard it and acted on it. One of his first moves was to anchor Israel's concerns into the heart of U.S. foreign policy. He didn't just approach presidents. He spoke directly to American lawmakers, think tanks, and influential lobbies. He built a bipartisan consensus that Iran's nuclear aspirations were not just an Israeli concern, but a global one. By 2015, when the nuclear deal known as the JCPOA was introduced, Netanyahu bypassed the White House and addressed the U.S. Congress directly, warning of an existential threat. It was a moment of unprecedented defiance, and it worked. He ensured Iran's nuclear file became a top-tier political issue across administrations. But his strategy wasn't limited to the United States. Netanyahu forged quiet but powerful partnerships with Arab nations, particularly Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, by framing Iran as their common enemy. These nations had historically been at odds with Israel, but Netanyahu understood the shifting sands of geopolitics. He built a coalition not with loud declarations, but with shared fear. He used back-channel diplomacy to align regional interests, knowing that if Sunni Arab states felt threatened by Shia Iran's rise, they would naturally move closer to Israel's position. The Abraham Accords, while presented as a peace agreement, were also part of this broader alignment, built on mutual distrust of Iran. In Europe, Netanyahu tirelessly lobbied governments and intelligence networks, pressing them to tighten sanctions and reevaluate diplomatic leniency. He shared Israeli intelligence findings, exposed Iran's hidden sites, and made sure that European powers couldn't ignore Tehran's actions. He turned quiet skeptics into reluctant participants in an international campaign to isolate Iran. Even countries with strong economic ties to Iran found themselves reconsidering deals, wary of being seen as complicit in a potential threat. Every ally became a chess piece. Every agreement, a pressure point. Netanyahu ensured that Iran wasn't just pressured by one nation, but surrounded by many. Diplomatically, financially, regionally, and ideologically, Iran began to feel the weight of the world pressed down. And in doing so, Netanyahu created a structure where even if Israel paused its efforts, the momentum of global resistance would continue. This web of alliances was not born overnight. It was cultivated over years through secret meetings, intelligence exchanges, and strategic diplomacy. Netanyahu's genius wasn't only in uniting friends. It was in persuading them that their future safety depended on Iran's containment. Through this, he built a global wall around Tehran's nuclear ambitions, brick by brick, alliance by alliance, all without firing a single shot. While the world focused on Iran's external enemies, Benjamin Netanyahu focused on a quieter, more insidious strategy, weakening Iran from within. He understood that no matter how resilient a regime appeared from the outside, it could be brought to its knees if its foundation, the people, began to crack. Netanyahu's long-term plan wasn't just about bombs or sanctions. It was about eroding the spirit of Iran's nuclear dream by creating pressure so intense that it would force the country to collapse in on itself. Central to this strategy was the weaponization of sanctions. Netanyahu relentlessly campaigned for harsher economic measures against Iran, targeting not just its government, but its youth class, its industries, and its youth. He knew that nuclear facilities couldn't thrive if the economy suffocates, if talent flees the country, and if the public begins to turn against the very project meant to symbolize strength. With the support of the United States and other allies, Netanyahu helped orchestrate economic pressure that cut Iran off from global banking systems, paralyzed its oil exports, and inflated its currency into worthlessness. This wasn't just about denying funds to a nuclear program. It was about sowing doubt and frustration within Iran's own borders. As daily life became more difficult, as shelves emptied and prices soared, ordinary Iranians began questioning whether the nuclear pursuit was worth the suffering it brought. The very people once expected to rally behind national pride now saw the program as a burden, not a symbol of power. But economic pressure was just one piece. Netanyahu's strategy also involved information warfare. Through cyber tactics, intelligence leaks, and media campaigns, Iran's leadership was constantly exposed, embarrassed, and forced to explain failures they could not control. Documents were stolen, covert operations revealed, and high-ranking officials assassinated. These events were not only demoralizing, they created an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust within the regime. Iranian scientists no longer felt safe. Officials no longer felt confident, and the public no longer felt hopeful. By fostering unrest, Netanyahu aimed to create a rift between Iran's government and its people. He encouraged a narrative that the leadership was corrupt, incompetent, and dragging the nation into ruin over a dream that would never be realized. Protests began to rise, not just against the regime, but against the very policies that isolated Iran from the world. With each new wave of unrest, the regime found itself forced to shift resources from scientific advancement to internal security, choking its own progress to survive politically. Perhaps most critically, Netanyahu's strategy ensured that the Iranian youth, the next generation of scientists, thinkers, and leaders, grew up in an environment of hardship and hopelessness. Many of the brightest minds fled the country in search of stability, leaving behind a vacuum in the very intellectual infrastructure needed for nuclear advancement. In weakening the morale, the economy, and the internal unity of Iran, Netanyahu didn't just delay the nuclear dream. He rewired the nation's ability to believe in it at all. The world often imagines the collapse of a nuclear program as something loud, missiles flying, facilities bombed, governments toppling and dramatic. But the truth behind Iran's nuclear dream is far quieter. It didn't end in a headline-grabbing war. It wasn't crushed in a single moment. It simply faded piece by piece under the weight of isolation, disruption, and relentless psychological warfare. This was the final, most subtle piece of Netanyahu's 30-year plan, ensuring that by the time the world looked closely, there was nothing left to destroy. The dream had already collapsed under its own exhaustion. Iran's scientists were still working, but they were second-guessing their own safety. Iran's leaders were still speaking defiantly, but their audiences were shrinking. Facilities remained operational, but morale had drained from their halls. The international stage no longer viewed Iran as a rising nuclear threat. It saw a fatigued state grappling with internal instability, decaying infrastructure, and mounting despair. Netanyahu's plan wasn't to fight Iran in one decisive battle. It was to slow them down until they stopped moving altogether. And by doing so, he turned what once looked like a sprint into an endless uphill crawl. The nuclear program continued to exist on paper, but the energy behind it, the ambition, the momentum, the public support, was steadily dismantled. Iran was still enriching uranium, but it was doing so in the shadows, unsure of what consequences would follow. Every decision became a risk calculation. Every step forward required glancing over the shoulder. Netanyahu ensured that Iran would never feel secure enough to fully commit to the final phases of nuclear development. There was always a threat, seen or unseen, waiting to strike.